suspect, just like those prominent assassinations of yesteryear where there was critical and suspicious ADL involvement in the JFK, RFK, and MLK assassinations, if you twist my arm, I think the ADL, in my opinion, there's some breadcrumbs here. There's some breadcrumbs here. And especially given some of their statements, after the assassination, I don't trust them. I'm sorry, but there's just dozens. There's like 20, at least 20 parallels between the Charlie Kirk assassination and those three other big assassinations.
Hello, dear friends of the truth. My guest today is Sam Parker. Hello, Sam.
How you doing, Oliver? Good to be with you and your wonderful audience today.
Thank you. So I invited you because, in my opinion, you're one of the best researchers in the Charlie Kirk case, and we will talk about that extensively. But first, to your person, you ran for Senate in Utah, so please tell us something about you.
Yeah, so I grew up in a little town in Washington State, and then I moved to Utah, where much of my ancestry is from. I'm LDS, and so I went to Utah to go to college at Brigham Young University, BYU. That was several years ago, and then I stayed and worked there, and I've been there mostly ever since, except for a short stint I did in Arizona when I got my MBA, my Master's in Business Administration at Arizona State University. And, so I was in Utah working, having a career, and have always been politically interested, politically involved, politically inclined, shall we say. And through a variety of mechanisms and events, I ended up running for the U.S. Senate against Mitt Romney in 2018. Never really, I think the last time I was really on board with Mitt Romney was probably 2008. Remember when he ran for president in 2008 and was beaten by John McCain. And
right.
I think I was fairly on board with him then because it was between him and Huckabee and John McCain and, of course, Barack Obama on the Democrat side. So I was definitely against Barack Obama. And between John McCain, Mitt Romney and Mike Huckabee, at least in 2008, I'm like, yeah, let's go Mitt. He'd had a fairly successful stint as the Massachusetts governor. Some problems, obviously, Romney care and what have you. But he still had a lot of the aura and the glow from having saved the Olympics in Salt Lake City in 2002. And that's how I mostly knew of him, because I lived in Salt Lake City. I went to the Olympics. It was right after 9/11. It was really a momentous occasion for the country and for Salt Lake City and Utah in particular. And I had a wonderful experience in those Olympics. And so Mitt Romney had a massive cachet of high political, value, especially in Utah, and to people who had been around back then. And so in 2008, I was basically on board with him. I mean, it wasn't like, super rah-rah Mitt, because, again, he wasn't touching all the bases for me. But he was my guy, and I didn't like how McCain and Huckabee were basically dragging his religion, which is my religion as well, through the mud to try to score cheap political points. I didn't like that. But by 2012, again, of course, he was running against Barack Obama. By then, I think a lot of people had soured on me, and I had soured on him too. And I held my nose, because, we were trying to defeat Obama, and Obama was, at the time, if you're a conservative or Republican, Obama was just like the worst president in history, the worst president in the world, trying to lead the fundamental transformation of America, right? And so, we hold our nose and we support Mitt Romney. But the problem is he really just rolled over. He folded like a tent, folded like a cheap suit, right? Pulled his punches. He came out, scored some big points in the initial, you remember there were 3 presidential debates, and he just like it's like he gave up. It's like he just like it's like he was playing some sort of gentleman's game where like here you had Obama on the ropes multiple times in these debates, and instead of landing some like decisive blows, he just backed off. And it was just like,
Okay.
oh shucks, And this really, honestly, Oliver, this infuriated a lot of people. I have a lot of friends in the conservative movement, in the Republican Party, and LDS friends who had been big supporters of Mitt, who are absolutely turned off by that. How he had the momentum and just gave it away because he didn't want to be mean.
Okay.
And
So
I think he got bad advice from his campaign backers and campaign manager, Stewart, I forget his last name. He got some bad advice. And instead of going for the jugular, winner take all, he backed off and made it a gentleman's game. Well, the Democrats and people like Obama, these guys are Chicago, hitters. These are gangsters. They're playing for
okay,
keeps.
let's not get too detailed on the Mitt Romney thing because
Yeah.
he's in the past. But you have a motto on your
Right.
other X account, which I found interesting, is "Make government local again," which is also one
Well,
of
it's
my
make
creed.
American government local again. And at the
Yes.
time, when I ran, it was in the middle of the MAGA movement, right? So, that occurred to me, that came to me because I've always believed in local government. And the reason why I went on about Mitt Romney is because by 2018, when he was running, I had so soured on this guy that I'm like, Mitt Romney cannot represent Utah. So that's why I jumped in. Other people wouldn't jump in. They didn't want to run against him. So I said, oh, if nobody else will do it, then I will do it. Right? So that's how I ended up getting into the race. Now, here's something you need to know briefly, and then I'll get back to your question. In Utah, we have a unique election system. It's called a caucus system. No other state in the United States has this system. Okay, and what it essentially is, it's a neighborhood caucus and convention system that acts like a primary before the primary. So it's like a primary that selects the candidates who are going to be on the primary ballot. And anybody can run. Anybody in Utah can run and go through this caucus convention process, right? And get on the primary ballot. You don't have to have a lot of money. You don't have to buy a lot of media. You don't have to do any of these things. And so that's how I ran. I ran through this caucus convention system in Utah. You can't do this in other states, Oliver, just in Utah. Anyway, so that was sort of my political background. That's how I got my feet wet into running for politics and being politically active. And well, I'd been politically active before that, but on the other side of it, not as a candidate, right? So when I ran, I had been working out this idea for actually many months prior to that, before I ever even had the idea of running. I'd been talking to people and online about something that I had called "Make American Government Local Again," and it describes exactly what my governing philosophy at the time was. And it just so happened that it fit that whole MAGA acronym quite well. MAGA is it's got an extra L in there, right? And so now it sort of drafts off of the MAGA movement, but it takes it a step further. Not just make America great again, but let's make government local again. And that's how we'll make America great again, right? Bring the government, the power back to the people. All right, back to the citizens and away from Washington, D.C. It also means
What
bringing power back to the states.
what can you tell me about this? Is because as I see it, this was like the founding fathers wanted it. I can tell you one thing in the German. It's not the real constitution; it's the basic law. There is in it that every community can manage itself, but nobody does it. And I assume that this was also what the founding fathers wanted, but the federal government got bigger and bigger.
Well, yeah, you've actually hit it right on the head, because also if you look in my Twitter profile, I call myself a neo-federalist. So basically
Yes.
what I'm saying is I want to return to original federalism in America. And original federalism in America was the power was split between Washington, D.C., or the federal government, and the state governments in coordination with the people. It was like this Frankenstein combination where the states together as sovereign entities had as much power as the federal government did. So like no one of they could check each other. And the way they did this, Oliver, was through the Senate. Originally, the state legislators appointed their senators. And the senators were accountable to the state legislatures, not to the people, not to the people, to the state legislatures. So here's, and this is really critical for people to understand. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but this is what you have to understand. When the state legislature appointed those senators, and those senators were beholden to the state legislature, if you wanted to buy a senator in Washington, D.C., if you wanted to influence him, you couldn't buy him directly. You had to buy the whole state legislature. You see? You had to buy the whole state legislature.
Yeah.
So that made it, back in the day, very cost prohibitive. It was very difficult to buy a senator like they do now, because now you can just buy a senator directly. You can just give him a bunch of money for his campaign, and now you own him, right? But you couldn't do that before. You had to buy the entire state legislature and get the legislature to appoint the guy you wanted. So it took orders of magnitude more resources to be able to do that. As a consequence, there was virtually no money in U.S. Senate races prior to that change, which was the 17th Amendment in 1913. And there was virtually no money.
That's interesting. That's interesting, because that was the founding of the Fed. There was the income tax was introduced, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, it was all done at the same time. There's a couple other things I can throw in there too. Exactly, that all happened at the same time. In 1913, that's when the United States was actually overthrown. And the federal government seceded from the states. Because with the 17th Amendment, they said, we're not going to have the state legislatures represented in Washington, D.C. anymore. We're going to have the people elect the senators rather than the state legislature. And this fundamentally altered the actual structural fabric of the United States and the Constitution, because when the founders and the states came together and formed the federal government, they said, well, the states need representation in Washington, because only the states will have the power to be able to check the federal government. And the way they gave themselves power in the federal government was by controlling the Senate. Like, that was a big lever. Like, no act of Congress can go through, can be passed without the approval of the Senate. And so before that change, you needed the approval of the actual state legislatures to get anything done. So, like, if you wanted a declaration of war, if you wanted to appoint federal judges, if you wanted approval for the federal budget, the state legislatures themselves had to approve those things. And they would tell their senator how to vote. And if he didn't vote the way they wanted, well, they'd just yank him out of there in the next election, right? So he was there as an ambassador. Senators were basically ambassadors for these 50 little sovereign countries inside the United States. Well, it was only 48 or 47 back then, but you get my drift. And what happened was they took that away. They took the Senate away from the state legislatures, and they said, well, now people can just run and people can vote for them. What did this do? What did this do? Now, you already kind of alluded to it, because the same year they instituted the income tax. Before the income tax, the federal government wasn't allowed to tax private citizens individually. They weren't allowed to take your paycheck. They weren't allowed to do any of those things. That is a massive power, right? And so previous to that, the federal government, if they had a budget, and they needed it funded, that funding came from the state legislatures. And the state legislatures could tell them to pound sand, like, well, we don't like your budget, we're not voting for it, and we're not sending you the money to pay for it until you meet our demands. And so this kept America's budget low. It kept its debt low. It kept the money low, and it kept a lot of money out of politics. Now, I'm not going to say there wasn't any money in politics. There was, but there was far less of it than there is now. And our debt to GDP was way, way lower than it is now, because this controlled for that. So in 1913, they said, no, we're going to have an income tax. So that's going to take now the federal government, this massive leviathan, can abuse private citizens on an individual basis. Tremendous tyranny. Tremendous tyranny. Our founders would have never allowed that.
What do you know?
Let me finish this here.
Yes.
And then they also took away the Senate. And then they established the Federal Reserve, as you said. So what this did is it moved the locus of power. Like, where's power focused? It was in the states. The locus of power was in the states and the state legislatures, and it was moved to big business and big finance and the banks. The locus of power was moved from the state legislatures, which represented their people, and moved to the big money power. That's where the locus of power was shifted. And so now the money power rules politics rather than the people and the state legislature power. That's what happened in 1913. That's when the federal government seceded from the states. Now there's no tether. Now the states have no recourse to restrain the federal government. It's a runaway freight train. We can't stop it, and they can take our money, and the states can't stop that anymore either. There's no firewall between the states and the federal government or the people and the federal government. It has completely isolated itself and established itself as a totalitarian tyranny ruling over us. But that is not how our country was established. So make American government local again, getting back to my campaign slogan, and neo-federalism, that means repealing the 17th Amendment, putting the Senate back under the control of the state legislatures, getting rid of the income tax, getting back to originalism. This is how you make American government local again, by literally just putting the power back to where it used to be, the way it was when the country was founded.
Seems very rational to me. And by the way, in my recent book, I proved that the Rothschilds were behind the founding of the Federal Reserve. Many people claim that, but I have the proof in my book, so I can give it to you later. Because many people say, yeah, the Rothschilds were behind it, but they don't prove it. But I have the proof, and I wouldn't wonder if the other changes in legislation, they were also somehow behind it. But
there was involvement from the same Wall Street power players, absolutely. You know, a lot of the same names crop up. The Schiff family, the Loeb family, the Warburgs, all these people, they were massively involved back then. Absolutely, of course, they helped run the media back then. They helped take us to war. Absolutely, they were instrumental in these fundamental transformations of America. So what's interesting is a lot of conservatives and Republicans will say, hey, we just got to get back to the Constitution. And I'm like, no, not really. The Constitution's actually been broken. We don't need to get back to the Constitution. We need to fix the Constitution. We need to fix it and repair it. And then and then put in some safeguards for the future so we don't make the same mistakes again.
Yeah, one of the founding fathers, what was it, Adams? Some of them said, or somebody else, he said, if anybody would suggest a central bank, he should be killed or something like that. But that was the same.
Very strong feelings about banking.
Yeah, but that was the same guy who introduced then the first central bank. I don't know the name.
Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, yes. Yeah. So he was bought in the meantime, obviously. So would you think that, or do you know one senator today who is not bought and paid for, in your opinion?
No, they're all bought and paid for, because remember, the money power now rules the day. It costs, $10, $50, $100, $150 million now to run for the U.S. Senate. That didn't used to be the case. There used to be virtually no money in Senate campaigns. And I'll tell you something else beyond that. There was also almost no money in campaigns for the House of Representatives. You know how we have a House in the United States, we have a House of Representatives and a Senate, and it's a bicameral legislature, two centers of power. And originally the people voted, white men voted for their representatives in the legislature, and then the state legislatures appointed the senators. Because there was no money in the Senate campaigns, because the state legislatures controlled them, there wasn't a lot of money in House races either. Because, let's say I can spread some money around and get a congressman elected.
Yeah. It wouldn't change anything.
If I don't control the senators that go with them. Because remember, I have to get legislation passed in both houses. So if I don't control the senators, then it's not really worth a whole lot to me to buy up the congressmen. I got to control both. But because I can't buy up both senators, because to do that, I got to purchase an entire state legislature, then what that did is it kept money out of the House races too. So as a result, there wasn't hardly any money involved in political campaigns back at the turn of the century, the 1900s back then. There was a lot of money in it because it didn't do any good to buy a congressman without buying the senator as well, both senators, and you couldn't buy both senators unless you bought an entire state legislature. So it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. Not really. And so this, this kind of kept, government local, and it kept it reduced, and it kept it limited. And that was a really big problem for the masters of the universe because they want to take this country to war. They want a military-industrial complex. They want a central bank. They want to make all these moves, and they can't because the state legislatures and the people of America didn't care about any of that and didn't want any of it. And so what they had to do is they had to first fundamentally alter the fabric of America, overthrow the Constitution. Now we can create a federal government that has seceded from the states and the people, a federal government that we can now control independent of those mechanisms. And now we can take it to war. Now we can have a central bank, right? Now we can do all these moves and global empire building and international intrigue and all these things, all these tyrannies that we didn't have before.
Yeah, but very interesting. That should be taught in school. Then everything would change. So apparently, 1913 was a very important year. But let's jump into the future because you just put out a space. I didn't listen to it yet. It's 3 hours or something. But I was very curious about the thesis because it never occurred to me that also in the MLK, Martin Luther King case, there could be an Israeli involvement because I was never thinking of that. What does that have to do with the other thing? Maybe you can briefly summarize what's the case here.
There were 3 interested parties, at least. There were 3 main interested parties in seeing Martin Luther King dispatched. And you have to have a strong background of the politics of the 50s and 60s and even into the 1970s to fully understand this, but I'll try to sort of give people a shorthand. Martin Luther King, of course, was a civil rights activist, a black civil rights activist. But no man is an island. And Martin Luther King was not the genius behind the civil rights movement. He was a front man. He was a front man. He was the guy. He was the lead singer, if you will, one of the lead singers at the microphone.
With a good voice. With a good voice. He had a good voice.
Yeah. And, but he had a whole band behind him, and he had a bunch of producers behind him, right? And he had he had a record label behind him and distribution channels. I'm being metaphorical, but not too much. I mean, because the same people that run the record companies and record labels were also running him. That's where I'm going with it. He was a production. His right-hand man, or his inside man, who handled him, who ran him, was a communist by the name of Stanley Levison. Okay, and he had many other communists behind him as well, of a certain ethnicity common to a little Middle Eastern country, halfway around the world. These people were communists, and that's who he was. He had a communist background and a communist indoctrination. And of course, when you look at the civil rights movement, organized Jewry, we could call it organized Jewry, the system of organized Jewry, they're interlocking organizations and NGOs and law firms and charities and these types of things. It's a system, right? It's a system that works together. And they were the major power and the major influencers and financiers of the civil rights movement. And they were, I've read figures, something like 2/3 of the donors or 2/3 of the money behind Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, was funded by these organizations of organized Jewry. All right, like the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress, and the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, and the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was actually founded and run by organized Jewry. And there were dozens, hundreds of these organizations that were partnered together with Martin Luther King and his organization and other black organizations. And you can get online, you can look this up. This was known as the Grand Alliance. The alliance between organized Jewry and the organized blacks in America was known as the Grand Alliance. And they're quite open about this. There's books, articles, magazines, all sorts of stuff. They're very proud of their
Yeah, yeah, because they were proud of it. Yes,
yeah, they're very proud of
there are
their
a lot of
involvement in the
things.
civil rights
There
movement.
are a lot
Yeah,
of things in history where they admit something because they were proud at the time. For example, Bolshevism. They were proud at the time, and
right.
so you can look it up.
Well, and these Jewish systems come from in the 50s and 60s that were backing Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement? Well, let me tell you where they came from. They came from the pogroms in the Russian Empire. A lot of it. A lot of it came from Europe, from outcasts, from Jewish outcasts in the Russian Empire and other parts of Europe. From about 1880 onward, between 1880 and 1920, roughly speaking, there were various pogroms in the Russian Empire, and that was because of efforts at revolution. Like there was Jewish anarchist groups were behind the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1880 or 81, and so there were pogroms after that. And so many of them fled. Many of these Jews fled as refugees to the United States, hundreds of thousands of them, maybe millions, and then and to England and to Germany and France. Then in 1905, there was an attempted Bolshevik uprising in the Russian Empire trying to overthrow the Tsar, led by Leon Trotsky and other Bolsheviks, and that was put down. And there were pogroms again. And so, but by that point in time, because of the previous things that had happened, England and France had basically closed their borders to these people. They're like, we don't want any more of these people. And so a majority of them fled to Germany and the United States. A few went to Argentina as well. And what you see in the 19-teens and the early 1920s is you see all of these fugitives, these Jewish fugitives from the Russian Empire, found or start a bunch of communist parties. It's a Jewish fugitives from the Russian Empire that will found communist parties in Argentina, in the United States, in China, in Germany, in England, and eventually also in Palestine. Okay, and so like this is just what it is. And so when you come to the United States, the Communist Party USA, I believe, was founded in around 1919 by some Jewish fugitives from the Russian Empire, fresh fugitives, and some of their previous generations fugitives came together, found the Communist Party USA. And when you fast forward to the 1930s and 40s in the United States, and by their own admission, about half of all members of the Communist Party in the United States in the 30s and 40s are Jews, and a vast proportion of their leadership is also Jewish. So that's the reality in the United States now, due to the Red Scare, McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the House, Committee on American Activities. In the late 40s and early 50s, and also due to Stalin's doctor's plot in the Soviet Union, right? Jews.
Explain that. Explain that, please, with the doctor's plot. What do you
So the
mean?
doctor's plot was basically Stalin perceived that Jews in the Soviet Union, especially high-level ones, were not loyal to the Soviet Union, and that they were trying to undermine him. And so he basically eliminated them. That's really what it comes down to. The ones that he perceived as disloyal or working to undermine him and the Soviet and the Russian people, the Soviet people, he eliminated them. And so this was known as the doctor's plot. And so this happened in the 50s. It was basically happened at the same time the Red Scares happened in the United States. And all of a sudden, the Jewish appetite to be members of all of these communist parties around the world, because these communist parties were being backstopped by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was backstopping all of these communist parties, but because of what they saw as Stalin's treachery and the optics of what was going on, and the Red Scare in the United States, they fled from these communist parties. In the United States, there's no different. Many of the communists in the United States, they fled the Communist Party in the 1950s. And landed in the Democrat Party.
Yes.
Okay. Now they changed their party affiliation, but their goals remained the same. All the things they wanted remained the same. They just were in a different party now.
Yeah, and
Right?
Democratic Party was, because that's why they were called liberal. They were more libertarian, more decentralized, and so on. I think J.P. Morgan also played a major role, which is also a Rothschild agent, which I show in my book. So yeah, so they overtook the Democratic Party basically.
That's right. So this takes us to Martin Luther King. Now, these same people, they backstopped Martin Luther King, and they basically ran the civil rights movement. Now, this is where I have to qualify this and say to people, look, I don't care if you agree with the civil rights movement or disagree with the civil rights movement. This is what happened. This is who did it, and these were their goals, and this is how they accomplished it. Agree with it or disagree with what they did. This is what happened. Okay, so this is what happened. So Martin Luther King becomes a mouthpiece, a front man for this civil rights movement that is in the majority organized and funded by former communist Jews, by organized Jewry with roots in communism. And, that's just who was behind him. We could call these left-wing Jews, Bolshevik Jews, left-wing Jews, however you want to frame that. That's who that wing was. Then, so keep that right here, keep placeholder for that. There was something else going on in the 1960s besides the civil rights movement, and that was the Vietnam War. Now, most Americans don't understand this and don't know this, and I only recently learned about this over the last year or two myself. But the Vietnam War is not what it appears to be at first glance. It was sold to America, and has been sold to Americans in our history books as part of the there was this domino theory that communism was taking over the world, and America had to go, save the world for democracy, right? Save democracy and stop the communist threat, right? The communist dominoes from falling. So we were stopping communism. That's what we had to do. We had to fight for freedom, save democracy, and stop the dominoes of communism. And this is why we had to send our boys to go die in the jungles of, Vietnam. But when you dig in and look at what was going on, Vietnam starts under Eisenhower, really, and then gets going more under Kennedy. But when you look at the people that were really involved in promoting and pushing this war, there's a facet, there's a group of people in that we're not supposed to talk about. And let me give you an example. The mastermind, who literally is known as the architect of Vietnam, was the National Security Advisor named Walt Rostow. Walt Rostow was the children of Jewish immigrants who fled the Russian Empire. Okay? Mm-hmm. And in fact, he had so much influence under LBJ in the Johnson administration that he was known as America's Rasputin. That's how much America's Rasputin. We all know about Rasputin had all this influence in the Russian court. That's how much, and it's really kind of appropriate because he was a Russian Jew as well. So he's America's Rasputin, right? Or we could call him another Russian Rasputin, but in America this time. That's Walt Rostow. He's the one that encouraged Kennedy to send more troops into Vietnam. He's the one that encouraged escalation. He's the one that pushed Lyndon Johnson to escalate, the U.S. incursion into Vietnam. He was the mastermind behind Operation Rolling Thunder and the massive bombing campaigns in the mid to late 1960s. It was him. Now, right behind him, his right-hand man, was his brother, Eugene Rostow, okay? Who was the Undersecretary of State, whose job it was basically to sell to the world the legality of this war and the necessity of this war. Massive Zionist. Eugene Rostow was a massive pro-Israel Zionist, okay?
But what was the logic behind it? What does that have to be with Zionism in Vietnam?
I'm glad you asked because, well, in the 1960s, Israel was a fledgling small country surrounded by very powerful countries. Syria, the United Arab Republic, or what we know as Egypt now, right? And these other countries, they were much larger powers, relatively speaking, with respect to Israel than they are now. Okay, they were real threats. And the Cold War was really ramping up. And you had the United States and the Western powers aligned with Israel, and you had the Soviet Union aligned with the Arabs. And so you had a situation where the Middle East could have easily become a flashpoint. And so John F. Kennedy was trying to get rid of nuclear weapons. He was trying to ramp down the Cold War. He was trying to establish peace. This is really what he wanted to do. And so he, in October 1963, 6 weeks before he was assassinated, he issued a National Security Action Memorandum, NSAM number 263, calling for the removal of American troops from Vietnam as a precursor of a total withdrawal of America from Vietnam. the day, and then 6 weeks later, the day before he was assassinated, he reiterated that to his assistant press secretary, and said he got the American casualty report that day, and he said, uh, Vietnam isn't worth one more American life, and when I get back from Dallas, I'm going to do something about that. It's not worth one more American life, and he wanted to get America out of Vietnam by 1965. That was
Yeah,
JFK's goal.
and he was an opponent of the nuclear program of
He
Israel, of
fought
course.
Ben Gurion in Israel, trying to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. He tried to register them as, the Israel lobby, which was back then was known as the Jewish lobby, organized Jewry, was under the AZC. He tried to get them to register as foreign agents under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. But you know what? There's a couple other things too. He was actually in favor of the UN Resolution 194, Palestinian right of return. Okay.
Yeah.
And he was also preventing offensive weapons from flowing into Israel because he didn't want an arms race in the Middle East that could create a Cold War flashpoint in the Middle East. He didn't want an arms race. So he prevented offensive weapons from going to Israel from the United States, and he withheld most defensive armaments as well. He opted for limited defensive capabilities and mostly humanitarian aid. That's all he would give Israel. Now, at the time, he was giving speeches at the Zionist Organization of America. He was writing books with in partnership with the ADL. To the American public, John F. Kennedy would have looked like a Zionist and a great friend and ally to Israel and the Jewish people. That's what he looked like to people at the time.
There's, by the way, I want to just inject that the Kennedys had an old feud with the Rothschilds. Just to put that in, it's also in my current book.
They did. Organized Jewry held a grudge against the Kennedy family because their father, Joseph Kennedy, who had been the ambassador in the run-up to World War II, they felt he'd been too sympathetic to Hitler and the Nazis, and hadn't done enough to, oppose them or whatever. And so they perceived that he was an anti-Semite and that maybe he had transferred that onto his sons. And so they held a grudge against the Kennedys and the Kennedy family.
Right.
But what's important to understand is that so he was, broadly speaking, he believed in Zionism for the Jewish people and that they should have a homeland in Israel. He believed all those things. And he took a lot of campaign contributions from the Jewish lobby. But he also believed in world peace and de-escalation of the Cold War and didn't want a nuclear arms race. And he felt strongly about those things too. And so he had a position where, like, I support Israel, I support the Jewish people, but I don't support Israel having nuclear weapons and igniting a Cold War arms race at the same time that I'm trying to convince the Soviet Union to disarm, because that's what he was trying to do. And he was having some success with that too. He was having a little bit of success with the Soviet Union after a while. They were laying groundwork for possibly denuclearizing. At that point in time, only, I think, 4 countries, it was China, or 5 countries, France, China, the UK, United States, and the Soviet Union. Those were the only countries that had nuclear weapons in 1963. And he had a real opportunity and a real belief that he could denuclearize the world and make the world safer at that point in time without having all these smaller, nuclear satellite states and rogue states. It was an achievable goal, and it looked like he actually might be able to achieve it. So the last thing he wanted was for Israel to get nuclear weapons. So he was vigorously opposing that. Well, after he was assassinated, the Dimona reactor went active about a month and a half later. Lyndon Johnson did nothing to stop it. But one of the other things that Lyndon Johnson did is he stopped the process for the Jewish lobby of having to register as foreign agents. He stopped that. But he also reversed Kennedy's Vietnam National Security Action Memorandum. And instead of upholding that and pulling us out of Vietnam, he called for escalation. Okay. Now this came from Walt Rostow. Okay. That's who this came from. This Russian Jewish immigrant, America's Rasputin. That was who was the point man behind it. But there's another fascinating aspect to this, Oliver. Remember how I told you Walt had this brother named Eugene? When Kennedy was assassinated, Eugene was not yet in government. Eugene was the dean of the Yale Law School. And the day or two after Kennedy was assassinated, he was on the phone with the White House and other prominent journalists to communicate a message to LBJ, to Lyndon Johnson. And that was, we should have a special commission to investigate this JFK assassination. We should have a special commission. That was Eugene Rostow's idea. And at his insistence, Alan Dulles was placed on the Warren Commission. Okay.
Yeah.
Also, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Earl Warren was presided over it, I believe that was also at the insistence or the idea of Eugene Rostow. And we should note that when Earl Warren ran for governor of California, he had a lot of money and support from the organized Jewish lobby. So, and then the Warren Commission also got Arlen Specter, another member of the organized Jewish lobby, onto the commission. But we know now that Alan Dulles at the time was being blackmailed by the Mossad. We've learned that Reuven Shiloh, one of the founding members of the Mossad and the first Mossad director, had been blackmailing Nelson Rockefeller and John and Alan Dulles and Prescott Bush, the grandfather of President George W. Bush. He'd been blackmailing them since the 40s. And so Kennedy fires Alan Dulles in June of 1962, a year and a half before the assassination. And then at the insistence of Eugene Rostow, Alan Dulles, who was fired by the guy who's just been assassinated, is put on this committee to investigate the assassination. And so, and then after that, after the Warren Commission's over, and the Warren Commission says, yep, nothing to see here, it was Lee Harvey Oswald after all, then Lyndon Johnson appoints Eugene Rostow to be the Undersecretary of State, to be one of the chief proponents and defenders of the Vietnam War. So now you have two...
Let me interrupt you here, please. I still don't get. What does Vietnam to do have to do with?
I'm getting there. I'm sorry. It's really big. I know it's really big, but I want to connect the dots for you and your audience.
Okay.
So you need to know that the point people behind the Vietnam War are people from organized Jewry, Zionists, okay, who have a generational grudge against Russia. Okay, because that's what Solzhenitsyn's book, 200 Years Together, was all about. It's all these pogroms in Russia, they're all about. They have this mutual animosity between Jews and Russians going back a couple centuries, at least, right? So we need to know these things. We need to be able to see the connection between the JFK assassination and these people and Vietnam. Now, what specifically was Vietnam doing for them? These Zionists and these refugees from the Russian Empire. Well, first of all, what was the Vietnam War? Wasn't it really just a proxy war between Russia and the United States? Fought in Vietnam and Southeast Indochina, but it was just a proxy war between Russia and the United States. Just like the Ukraine-Russia war is. Ukraine-Russia war.
Just to play devil's advocate, but they were communists, so why are they fighting the communists in Vietnam and the communists in Russia?
In 1920, Winston Churchill wrote a famous op-ed, and it's titled Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people.
Yeah, it's also my book.
Two competing ideologies in world Jewry at the time, Bolshevism and Zionism. And they didn't always get along. And they had different visions for how worldwide Jewry should organize itself and be successful and overthrow their enemies and establish their perfect world, their perfect paradigm. Over time, the Zionists have won out, but there is still a strong Bolshevik streak. Like Chaim Weizmann, one of the founding fathers, I think the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, he's a fugitive from the Russian Empire. He's a Bolshevik. But he's also a Zionist. Well, how is he a Zionist and a Bolshevik? Well, because what's important is how do we advance the interests for all Jews? Like, it's a group of people, it's a tribe, it's an international tribe of people. How do we advance our interests? And so there's these competing ideologies. And so what you see in the Cold War, and what you see in the United States and Zionism versus Bolshevism in Russia, is you see this battle. This internal battle between global organized Jewry, where they're sort of battling it out, but also at a certain level, they're doing what they're also protecting each other. And this is what I mean. You'll see people like Ben Shapiro now say, well, you'll see people like Ben Shapiro call the ADL, which is a leftist Jewish organization. He'll say, well, those aren't really Jews; those are just Democrats. And he will say, well, Jewish people didn't have any disproportionate influence in the Bolshevik Revolution. That's just a myth. They were just communists. They weren't really Jews, they were communists. But left-wing communist Jews will say the same thing about their right-wing Zionist Jewish brethren. So you'll have organizations like the Torah Jews or Jewish Voices for Peace who will say, well, Zionists aren't really Jews. Zionism isn't Judaism. They're not really Jews. We're real Jews, but they're not. So both sides will basically exculpate, free the guilt from their counterparts or their adversaries and say, well, communism wasn't Jewish and Zionism isn't Jewish. When it's, you see what I'm saying? So they both do this. So you had the 60s where but then you also had in the Soviet Union, you had Stalin and these Soviet premiers who did have some level of autonomy from the Bolsheviks, but not complete autonomy. And there definitely was this communist movement separate from that, but it was also wrapped up in it. It was mixed up in that, right? So what you have is the international organized international Jewry, these system of interlocking international organizations like the World Jewish Congress, the World Zionist Congress, and all these different international organizations, looking after the interests of the Jewish people. And so that sort of is outside of the Soviet Union, outside of the United States, or maybe sitting on top of it, if you will. And they're pushing for these types of things. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So now I'm going to get real drilled in. And I'm going to use an example. Recently, the Ukraine versus Russia war, what has it done? It's kept Russia occupied. It's a proxy war. It's really just a war between the United States and Russia. Again, that's what the Ukraine war is. And who's leading Ukraine? Well, it's a guy named Vladimir Zelensky who happens to be Jewish, okay? And who's the big financier and oligarch, the major oligarch behind this? Well, it's Larry Fink from BlackRock. Larry Fink from BlackRock is the major, massive oligarch involved in the Ukraine war. Who are the masterminds of the Ukraine war? It's Victoria Nuland and Antony Blinken. These are the masterminds of our side of this war. Like, again, and when Israel was attacked after October 7th, Antony Blinken flies to Israel and says, I come to you as an American, not just as an American, but a fellow Jew, right? So they have interests beyond their countries that they're a part of. That's what some of them do anyway. And they have organizations that help them achieve this. So what effect has this Russia-Ukraine war had on Israel? Well, this is the effect it's had. It's prevented Russia from being able to project force into the Middle East and to prevent Israel from making moves. So during this Russia-Ukraine war, it's weakened Russia. It's occupied it, right? And Russia wasn't able to backstop their ally, their satellite state, their vassal state, Assad in Syria, right? Israel was, with a coalition of partners and through various means, was able to overthrow Assad and basically balkanize Syria and remove it as an enemy, as a threat, if you will, as a threat anymore, right? Now they have free airspace all the way to Iran, because what does Israel want? It wants to take out Iran. It wants to establish greater Israel. It wants to establish dominance over all of its enemies and neighbors in the Middle East. And Russia was preventing that. When they tried to overthrow Assad with the fake, gas, the fake gas attacks in 2014 and so forth, Russia came in and stabilized the situation and prevented overthrow. But they weren't able to do that this time because they'd been weakened and they couldn't project the necessary force to shield Syria anymore. So that's one of the major goals of this war, was to occupy Russia and take it out of the Middle East, so to give Israel room to make moves against its enemies. And now we saw it move against Syria. We're seeing it move against Iran. And again, and Russia's been helping Iran, but now they can't help Iran like they were. So that leaves Iran tremendously vulnerable. So that's really one of the big things that's being accomplished by the Russia-Ukraine war, is it's moving a major oppositional force out of the Middle East, giving Israel room to operate and dominate. Now, let's go back to Vietnam. In the 60s, what's Israel trying to do in the 60s? It's trying to establish its dominance in the Middle East. That's what the Six-Day War in 1967 is all about. It's about overthrowing Nasser and about overthrowing Syria and overthrowing Jordan. these adversaries against, against the Jewish state, against the Zionist state. And so how do you do that when those countries are being backstopped by the Soviet Union, but you don't want to ignite like maybe a nuclear war? How do we create room in the Middle East when it's a front in the Cold War? It's a major front in the Cold War. How do we create room for Israel to operate under these conditions when there's these two superpowers basically duking it out on top of us? How do we make room for us to make our moves? Well, what we do is maybe we have a war way the hell over there, and we move those two guys, and we move them over there. You see what I'm saying? We move them over there, get them out of the way.
Well,
now we have room to operate. But there's more.
is there maybe something in their writing which suggests that also, or is it just your?
I think there is. You have to sort of. You do have to be able
For
to
example,
know.
the PNAC thing that was in writing. They just say it there.
American Century, yeah. I think there are some things that you can find. I mean, obviously Walt Rostow, Eugene Rostow. I mean, like they talk they talk about these things. They supported Israel, and so we do have to sort of put on our glasses and examine this critically. But here's another thing that happened. Because of the Vietnam War, the United States military-industrial complex was massively expanded. And we all know, the military-industrial complex made famous by Eisenhower. And that happened basically in the 1960s, that massive buildup. After World War II, the American defense budget dropped to something like $9 or $10 billion per year. It was practically nothing, okay? It went up a little bit in the 50s as the Cold War ramped up. It went up a little bit. But then in the 60s, and Vietnam hits, and it goes from it had been, post-World War II, it had been like, say, $10 billion. And now we're hitting 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, $120 billion budgets in the 60s during Vietnam. And America's developing all this advanced weaponry and nuclear bombs and missiles and spy satellites and all this technology, right? And they're increasing their war-making capacity, their manufacturing capacity, their logistics, all of these things. And what does that do for Israel? Well, what it does is eventually Lyndon Johnson, again, remember Kennedy was preventing the flow of arms to Israel. But after he was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson comes in and he opens it up. He increases the money going to Israel. He starts sending tanks, artillery, fighter jets, bombers and stuff, all this stuff to Israel, offensive weaponry, lets them have the nukes. And what this does is it enables Israel to gain supremacy over its neighbors in the Six-Day War in 1967, and especially in 1973 Yom Kippur War, where the Arab states who were beaten in the 1967 war, they launch a counterattack on Yom Kippur in October of 1973, and they push Israel against the wall. Israel's back is up against the wall, and Golda Meir basically conducts nuclear blackmail on Richard Nixon and says, hey, you got to help bail us out, or else we got these nukes. We're gonna have to nuke them, and we just couldn't have that. So Nixon launches something called Operation Nickelgrass, which at the time was the largest aerial, military aid delivery in human history. Okay, and they send fighter jets, tanks, artillery, and just completely resupply Israel, and continue doing that throughout the 1970s. And what it does is it allows Israel to gain supremacy over their enemies, to the point where Egypt and Jordan basically throw in the towel and get bought off by the United States, and now they make nice, right? And we see how the United States has been supplying Israel for all of its actions in Gaza and against Palestine and against Syria and against Iran. Now we just keep sending them billions and billions and billions of dollars and more equipment, and aircraft carrier, battle groups, all these things. All of this stuff comes because of our war-making capacity as a result of the military-industrial complex buildup. So here's where I'm going to link it all up for you. Without the Vietnam War, the Cold War front in the Middle East cannot be moved out of the Middle East, and that leaves the Middle East cluttered, and it's not going to allow Israel to make independent moves. That's number one. Number two, without Vietnam, there's not going to be a military-industrial complex buildup. And without that buildup, the United States can't supply Israel with all the munitions and armaments it needs to dominate the Middle East and take it over. You can run this through any AI you want and ask it these questions, and any AI will tell you that Israel could not have gained dominance over its Middle East allies without the war-making capability from the United States.
Of course.
And the United States would not have been able to supply that without the military-industrial complex buildup, which would not have happened without Vietnam.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's
So
really the
now,
other side of the coin from now. So the Ukraine-Russia war now is meant to deplete Russia. It's meant to make room in the Middle East for Israel to make moves and to deplete Russia's ability to project force. Whereas Vietnam is sort of the other direction. It was to build up America's capability to project force on behalf of Israel. You see? And so Lyndon Johnson, so now let's bring it back to Martin Luther King. Lyndon
yes.
Johnson, the president, see, I told you this is big.
Yeah.
I'm trying to like, but
No, it's
so
super
now,
interesting. It's super interesting. Yeah.
yeah, so now Lyndon Johnson's the president. He's taken over from Kennedy, who's just been assassinated. Kennedy, who didn't want Vietnam, who didn't want war in the Middle East, who didn't want nuclear powers and arms race in the Middle East, he's been taken off the board. He's out. Lyndon Johnson's in, escalates Vietnam on behalf of Walt Rostow, who's saying that this is what we need to do. We got to do this, right? And Eugene Rostow, his brother, who helped, establish the Warren Commission cover-up, they're saying, hey, we got to go to Vietnam. Meanwhile, he's escalating all the aid to Israel, but at the same time, Lyndon Johnson's giving Zionist Jewry, world-organized Zionist Jewry, everything they want, literally everything they want, even covering up the USS Liberty attack. He's also giving left-wing organized Jewry everything they want with the civil rights movement. He's signing all the laws, he's sponsoring, he's advocating for all of them. The Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, that opens up America's borders. Am I too loud? Do I need to speak more?
No. I think
okay.
no.
And the Fair Housing Act of 1968, various Supreme Court decisions that his administration supports, and just all sorts of things. Lyndon Johnson's giving them everything they want, everything, right? So you have the left-wing Bolshevik organized Jewry and the civil rights, getting their entire slate of goals passed. You have the right-wing Zionist organized Jewry getting everything they want with Israel. And Martin Luther King is right at the nexus of that. He's working with left-wing Jewry, which a lot of right-wing Jews also supported the civil rights movement. Most of them supported it as well, because organized Jewry likes multiculturalism. They talk about this. This is not controversial. They talk about it. They write articles about it. They say how for the last 2,000 years in these Christian white European countries where where there's a high degree of homogeneity, they stick out and they become the other, and they see that as
you had an interesting statistic about BLM on your. We can put that in here on BLM, right? That was on your account. That also a right-wing Zionist organization also donated for BLM, right?
So during BLM, there were 627 Jewish organizations in the United States that represent the majority of organized Jewry in the United States, represent the majority of Jews in the United States. 627 organizations who took out a full-page ad in the New York Times in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with BLM. Wow. And, and all but 5 of them are pro-Israel Zionist organizations, right? So there's
that's super interesting. That's a proof right here.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's what happened. To Martin Luther King. He outlived his usefulness. And what happened is they built him up a national organization, right? Through their money, through their organizing, he became the head of a national organization. Well, in the late 60s, he decided to shift his focus away from the civil rights revolution towards larger issues. And in April of 1967, he formally comes out against the Vietnam War and denounces it and says, America should stop doing this, and we should put our money back into our own people, and also, the people in general, the poor people in the world in general. And he was scheduled to go on an Israel trip in November of 1967. It was a big deal. He canceled it. Changed his mind, canceled it. Thought it would be a bad
That reminds me awfully of Charlie Kirk, but we come to that.
Yeah, so anytime you see parallels with Charlie Kirk, national organization that they helped him build up, that's Charlie
Yeah.
Kirk too, right? And so he cancels his Israel trip, and later it comes out that he's actually was about to come out in favor of Palestine. Like he doesn't hate Israel, didn't hate Zionism, but like he was going to abandon his neutral his it was pro-Israel, then it was kind of neutral, then it was going to become more pro-Palestine. They took him out before that could happen. But also, when he came out against the Vietnam War in 1967, all of a sudden, a bunch of the Jewish-owned media platforms that had been supporting him for so many years withdrew their support and denounced him. And a lot of that money from these Jewish organizations that had been funding him and building him up withdrew their money. Does that sound a lot like Charlie Kirk too? Maybe didn't that happen to Charlie Kirk? And he didn't know, and he didn't know why this was happening at the time. He didn't get it. Well, it's because he didn't understand the importance of Vietnam to organized global Jewry. He didn't understand it. The New York Times, owned by the Sulzberger family, denounced him. The Washington Post, owned by the Graham family, they denounced him. The NAACP, which was founded and run by Jews at the time, withdrew its support. And even his close friend, Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche was a black man who actually helped negotiate the peace between Palestine and Israel after Israel's war in 1948. He helped negotiate that peace while he shot pool with Moshe Dayan, one of the leaders of the Israeli army. He shot pool with Moshe Dayan, and over shooting pool, they negotiated the terms, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1950 for that. So Ralph Bunche was a Zionist buddy, and he distanced him. He lost Martin Luther King. He even lost the support of Ralph Bunche, his close ally, and he didn't understand what this was going at the time. But he was determined to go forward anyway, because that's how much he believed in that Vietnam was not in our interest, was not in the interest of America, especially Black America or poor people in America, and he saw it, just a heinous crime. And so he was going to use his national organization to advocate against this war. Well, what was Charlie Kirk doing? Remember when it came out that when
Yes.
it was looking like Donald Trump was going to help Israel conduct a regime change war in Iran? Charlie Kirk went to the White House and argued with Trump and convinced him to not do anything more than just bomb the nuclear sites and to not conduct this regime change war. And Charlie Kirk spent all summer tweeting and doing videos and episodes on his podcast talking out against the neocon regime change wars, even if they were for Israel. He even in one of them, at least one of them, he even says that even it's like even if it benefits Israel, doesn't benefit America. He says, "No, I support Israel. They're my friends. I love the Jewish people. But I'm also an American, and I'm America first. And these regime change wars have been disastrous for Americans. We should get out of Ukraine. We should not do a regime change war in Iran." Well, what network, what system was Charlie tripping over when he's advocating against the Ukraine war and against the Iran war and these neocon wars? It's the same thing that happened to Martin Luther King. He's tripping over the same network of power.
Is there, before we come to Charlie Kirk, the parallels are really clear, but is there also something in the details of who killed him that there are connections? Because we will find out soon in the Charlie Kirk case, the Israel connections, there are already some, but is there also something like that in the MLK murder?
Kind of. I can't say that there's like a person that's like common to both. That's not the case. But I do think that the ADL was perhaps maybe involved in both. Martin Luther King's, one of his greatest allies during the civil rights era had been the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith. However, because he had sort of left the reservation, was sort of grabbing a little too much autonomy, for himself and for his organization. Because the other thing he was doing is he was basically getting off the civil rights track. He was getting off the civil rights bus. He's like, that's yesterday's news. I'm moving on to this other stuff. Well, the problem is the civil rights revolution wasn't done yet. And I'm going to get to your question, but I have to sort of go around the block here first. The civil rights revolution wasn't done yet because, and again, Whether you agree with it or disagree with it is immaterial. This was the goal of those behind it. The goal of those behind it was to integrate America and to destroy the white Christian foundation and monolith of American society. That was the whole idea behind it. Through the Civil Rights era, we can open our borders, we can destroy segregation, and then over time, we can erode the white monolith, the white Christian monolith of America. And throughout this whole era, you had Jewish interests and organizations pushing mass pornography and Supreme Court cases to legalize pornography and to take the Bible out of schools, to take prayer out of schools. Along with the civil rights legislations. But here was the problem. Coming into 1967, 1968, Martin Luther King he'd lost his zest for the civil rights movement. And he was moving on to these other things. But America was not yet integrated. It hadn't been successfully desegregated, and here's why. They had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, true, but that only applied to public places and places of employment and the government. So the vast majority of white America in its towns and neighborhoods and schools and businesses and stuff remained segregated. And because of this, like white landlords wouldn't rent to black people. And white-controlled banks wouldn't give loans to black people. And white home sellers wouldn't sell their homes to black people. And so because America still had private property rights and ownership over their property and their money, to some degree, they were able to maintain the white Christian monolith of America. And so it didn't really matter, okay, so your place of employment can't discriminate on the basis of race, and that park downtown can't keep black people out, whatever. But in my community, in my neighborhood, in my town, I'm all surrounded by white people, and so there's no black people, right? And so we still have our identity, we still have our cohesion, we still have our segregation, effectively. So they had to attack that. How do you integrate private America, private residence America? Well, this is what they did. They invented something called the Fair Housing Act, which outlawed the discrimination in renting and home selling and buying and loans on the basis of race or national origin.
And that was when? That was when?
Well, it was first introduced in 1966, but it failed. Congress wouldn't pass it because even though Congress had been passing all of the major civil rights legislation, that was a bridge too far for them. It was a bridge too far for them. They're like, look, we can't get behind that. That's a violation of private property rights. People have the right to sell their house to who they want to and to rent to who they want to. It's their property. That's a major violation of private property. So Congress voted it down. It did pass Congress in 1960. They tried again in 1967, Oliver. It failed again in 1967. Come 1968, they tried a third time. Guess what? It failed again. It was in purgatory. It was in legislative death. 0 for 3, strike 3 strikes and you're out. Okay? So, this is basically catastrophic for the people that are trying to push this revolution against white Christian America. It's been foiled. That plot's been foiled. That revolution's been stopped. Dead in its tracks. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Well, they had an idea. I submit this is where they got the idea. In 1965, there was something called Freedom Summer in Mississippi and in the South in general, but especially focused in Mississippi, where there was a massive drive to register black voters. At the time, something only like 7% of eligible black voters were registered to vote in Mississippi. And just a massive amount of Jewish money and organizations flowed into Mississippi in that summer of 1965. And to try to basically foment, to get more black people registered to vote. Well, during that summer, 3 people were kidnapped and murdered. And there's a movie about this called Mississippi Burning with Gene Hackman.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of it. Famous
movie.
I know
it.
And 2 of those 3 people were Jewish, okay? And then a third was a black guy. Nobody talks about him. They talk about the other 2 guys. But anyway, what happens is they use the momentum, the public outrage of these murders to pass something called the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which makes it easier for blacks to register to vote. It removes a lot of the obstacles that had been placed by the states to some of the states in terms of getting registered to vote and being able to vote in these things. And so they use the outrage from these murders to get to generate public support to get this law passed. Well, so that's 1965. Well, now just in 3 years in a row, 66, 67, and 68, you're trying desperately to get this Fair Housing Act passed, which is going to overthrow white Christian America. But you can't, because Congress won't go along with it. And the American people don't want it either. They're really against this because that's a violation of our private property. So how do you get the public behind this when the public is firmly against it? And so is Congress. Maybe you create a martyr. Maybe just like remember back in '65 when those guys died and we were able to, generate votes off of that outrage? I think that's what the situation you have here is like. Here's a guy, he was your guy, you built him up, Martin Luther King, you built him up, you helped him build a national organization, a national organization of influence. There was discussion of creating a third party. He was involved in discussions of creating a third party outside the two-party system, basically going rogue, going off on his own. He was willing to give up the Jewish donorship dollars. He was willing to step out against Vietnam. And now he's of no use to you in the Civil Rights Revolution. He's out. He's out. Like, he's been your point man. You built him this organization, and he checked out. He's gone. He's off the reservation. So, and what's more is we've now found out he's not going to go to Israel, and he's going to switch to supporting Palestine. Well, this is catastrophic. This is catastrophic. So you have a situation where you have left-wing organized Jewry aren't getting what they want out of this guy. Right-wing organized Jewry definitely is taking hits off of this guy. And then the regime, the Johnson regime, which is the nexus for both of these wings of power and both of these political movements, and they have a lot of financial interest in it as well, these people in the regime, they have, the military-industrial complex, war is big business, all these things, political careers, they have interest too. You have this diabolical iron triangle where all the incentives and all the interests are aligned between the regime, the Zionists, and the right-wing Zionists and the left-wing, Bolsheviks, whatever you want to call it, where their interests are all aligned and their interests all converge on Martin Luther King, and their interests are all going to be immensely improved if this guy's gone. And on April 23rd, 1967, 2.5 weeks after he gives his anti-Vietnam War speech, James Earl Ray, the patsy, the lone gunman who allegedly killed Martin Luther King, is sprung from the Missouri State Penitentiary by the FBI. We didn't know that at the time. It took several decades to find that out, but a witness later came forward. The son of Russell Adkins, one of the leaders of the Dixie Mafia, had been paid off by Clyde Tolleson, J. Edgar Hoover's second in command. So J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, sends Clyde Tolleson, his second in command, to go deliver a massive payment to Russell Adkins, one of the leaders of the Dixie Mafia, okay? And they go pay off the prison warden, and he takes his son, I think Russell Adkins Jr., I think that's how it went down. He was a 15-year-old kid at the time, in the car. And later, at the end of his life, he recounts the story. He's like, yeah, we took the money to the warden to pay him off, and that's how James Earl Ray was allowed to escape. The FBI paid for that. Why did the FBI spring James Earl Ray?
What is the Dixie? What is the Dixie Mafia? Is it anyhow connected to the Kosher Nostra? Because Meyer Lansky, there's connections to the Kennedy assassination.
So yeah, Meyer Lansky, obviously, you have Murder Incorporated, right? And you have the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia, teamed up. And a lot of, in Hollywood movies, people think, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, these are Jews. They're part of the Jewish mob, right? And they're not Sicilians. And the Dixie Mafia is just part of a larger criminal organization. And I don't have all the points mapped, but I believe they were working in conjunction with Carlos Marcello, who was a weapons trafficker and casino magnate in the South, like Louisiana. And he was partnered. He was a close partner with Meyer Lansky. Carlos Marcello was a close partner of Meyer Lansky. And here's where it gets really interesting, because James Earl Ray's handler was a man named Raul. And Raul helped traffic weapons for Carlos Marcello out of New Orleans. Well, Jack Ruby helped Carlos Marcello traffic weapons out of Houston. And so Jack Ruby
There we have it.
and Raul were actually known associates, and multiple witnesses placed them together. And when James Earl Ray's white Mustang was captured, one of the FBI agents that initially searched it found an envelope with a J from Raul, with Raul's name on it, and it had the letter J and a phone number. And it actually went to Jack Ruby's club in Dallas, which I believe was the Carousel Club. And multiple witnesses again saying that they knew each other. Jacob Leon Rubenstein, the man who murdered Lee Harvey Oswald, known associate of Raul, the handler for James Earl Ray. Here's what's really here's one of the biggest things. For that whole year that James Earl Ray was on the lam before he allegedly assassinates Martin Luther King, somehow he's given the alias Eric S. Galt. Right? He gets these an Alabama driver's license, and I think eventually a passport in the name of Eric S. Galt. Well, who is Eric S. Galt? Well, he's the head of a Union Carbide weapons manufacturing plant in Canada, and he has U.S. national security clearance. How did James Earl Ray get the identity of a weapons manufacturer with national security clearance? But it gets better. Oliver. This Union Carbide factory was manufacturing bomb triggers that were being smuggled through the Carlos Marcello weapons smuggling network to Israel.
But is it only the same name? I mean, it's not the same identity?
No, actually they have a similar likeness. And a lot of people think that one of the reasons why they gave him that identification is because he sort of had a general appearance that looked a lot like him. So if he was ever stopped, or if some policeman or law enforcement officer had accidentally come across him or stopped him, he would have looked like Eric Galt. And so no, that's there's articles about this. You can go read this. This is the identity that he somehow was able to get a hold of. And remember, he evaded capture for 14 months. 14 or 15 months he evaded capture. And he was eventually apprehended by Scotland Yard on his way to Africa, 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King. He nearly got away, So he was going to Mexico and Canada and back and forth and all over. How was he doing all? Where did he get the money? Well, he said that Raul gave him money. And we could keep going all night on this topic, but what I want people
don't forget the connection.
Oh, go ahead.
You wanted to establish a connection to the ADL because there's a ADL B'nai B'rith connection, right. The JFK murder. How is it in the MLK?
So Raul, James Earl Ray's handler, gave him an emergency phone number. And this emergency phone number he actually called in December of 1967, just a few months before he went to Memphis to allegedly assassinate Martin Luther King. This number was to a marine supply company run by a Samuel Laventhal of New Orleans, who was a member of the ADL of the B'nai B'rith.
Yeah, because we have that also in, the JFK invitation came by this club, and it was also B'nai B'rith guy.
ADL influence in the JFK assassination as well. Exactly. The Dallas Citizens Council had multiple Jewish members of the ADL. It's alleged that Abraham Zapruder may have been a member of the ADL. The owners of
and he was a Freemason. Zapruder was a Freemason, and the ideology of the Freemasons, which nobody knows, is the Kabbalah, but that's another topic.
Right, and then of course the owner David Wiesblatt, and I can't remember the other owner of the Daltex building, where a lot of witnesses placed some of the shots that's coming from, which is also housed the offices of Zapruder. Financed by members of the ADL, allegedly. So, and then, of course, there's the New Orleans connection. If you've watched the movie JFK and Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, there was stuff going on it. So what ends up happening is James Earl Ray later testifies to Congress during the 1970s when Congress is having the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He testifies before Congress that he learns from this Samuel Leventhal that Martin Luther King is going to start supporting Palestine, and that there's a very interested powerful Jewish organization that has soured on But he didn't want to say who it was in his congressional testimony because he didn't want to come off as anti-Semitic. But it's very clear that he was talking about the ADL. So where did James Earl Ray learn these things about Martin Luther King? You know, why is this member of the ADL in New Orleans telling James Earl Ray these things? How does he know these things, right? So then I think about, you know, like that you go to the RFK assassination. RFK was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in California after he won the California primary in June of 1968. And he was originally supposed to exit out through the ballroom. But at the last moment, he didn't. He changed his path and went out through the back, through the pantry, where Saran was waiting for him to shoot him.
Yep. Yep.
We now know, thanks to Michael Collins Piper and eyewitnesses, and now we also have the film. We actually have the film of this happening. His press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, is the person who detoured him from the ballroom and sent him back to the pantry. Frank Mankiewicz. Frank Mankiewicz was a member of the ADL.
Yeah.
Frank Mankiewicz later, in 1991, is going to be the PR man for the movie JFK, which is a whole other.
And it was financed by this Israeli agent. What's his name? The movie was financed.
The movie JFK is financed by an Israeli weapons trafficker and spy named Arnon Milchan. That's who financed and produced the movie JFK. Now, in 1991, people really didn't know much about Israel's nuclear program. They certainly didn't know about the fight that Kennedy was having with David Ben-Gurion over the Dimona facility and the development of nuclear weapons. They didn't know anything about that, but Arnon Milchan did, because he was instrumental in helping smuggle nuclear bomb parts out of the United States to Israel. And I think he was also possibly involved in the smuggling of nuclear material from the United States and other nuclear secrets to Israel. Right. And that came out in the 20-teens, like 2011 or 2013 or 2014. That came out that he had been a spy, was a spy for Israel, and had been a weapons trafficker of nuclear bomb parts. So Arnon Milchan in 1991, when he produced the movie JFK, which basically blamed the CIA, you know, a false dichotomy. Was it Lee Harvey Oswald or was it the CIA? Well, what if it wasn't either? You know, what if it wasn't either of them? He financed that movie. And he knew, you know, and they didn't say anything about the Mossad or Israel or nuclear weapons in that movie. Nothing of the sort, nothing about it, right? But he knew about that angle, and they hid the ball. They hid the ball. Well, Frank Mankiewicz, press secretary for RFK, who'd sent RFK to his death in the pantry, right? He's the one that does the PR for the film, and he writes a famous essay saying, hey, it's the right of Americans to question this government narrative. And if we don't believe it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and if we believe it was the CIA, we have the right to talk about that. The other thing, now, but there's another thing that happened in that movie, JFK. They basically deflected the blame onto the CIA and removed any mention of Israel and the Mossad. There was another thing they did. They blamed the war in Vietnam on the military-industrial complex. And there's a famous scene with Donald Sutherland that's like 3 or 4 minutes long. It's on my Twitter timeline, where he talks about all the helicopters and all the weapons and all the money and all the waste going on in Vietnam. Blames it all on the greedy generals and military-industrial complex. Doesn't mention that this military-industrial complex buildup is being used to supply Israel with its war machine. Doesn't say anything about that. So there's multiple things going on with the JFK movie that was produced by an Israeli spy. There's multiple things going on with that movie too. So you see how a lot of these things connect. So now let's go to Charlie Kirk. After the Charlie Kirk assassination, Kash Patel.
I want to interject that in my new book I have a lot about JFK also, and there's even more. There could also be a Rothschild involvement of Roy Cohn, which was the mentor of Donald Trump. So for that info, also you can go to my book also.
Hey, go check it out, guys, because look, it's a big story. We've left a lot of pieces out, but some people will protest against this. What I'm telling you. They're like, well, what about all this other stuff? And I'm like, well, all that other stuff, people already know about all that other stuff. It's in your textbooks, it's in the movies, it's on TV, it's in the news, it's what people talk about. I'm giving you the parts of the picture that you haven't been given, right? I'm giving you that big piece right here in the middle that helps make sense of all of it, right? Because people for years have argued, what was it, the mob that killed Kennedy? Was it the CIA? Was it the military-industrial complex? Was it Lyndon Johnson? Well, the answer is yes and no. What ties all those components together? What ties? It's like 6 lines, I think. There's 6 lines that tie all that together, you know, and that make sense of it. So that's what I'm doing. I'm giving you the piece that you didn't know about to help make sense of the rest of the pieces you did know about. That's what I'm doing. That's my purpose. So now let's go to Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk's assassinated. Kash Patel, Mr. Epstein files. What Epstein files? All of a sudden, he sends an FBI team to the crime scene, to Utah, to investigate. Which FBI team does he send? He sends the Connecticut team.
Yes,
Connecticut team that literally shares the office with the ADL.
With ADL.
Okay.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
And by the way, the ADL, admittedly, it trains all of the FBI agents. And it has for years. For years, the ADL has trained all the FBI agents. And the ADL has a very tight relationship with the FBI going back several decades. All the way back to at least the era of Martin Luther King. So the ADL is partnered with Martin Luther King, promoting him, backstopping him, helping him, but they're also spying on him. That's why they know what he's doing. And that's why basically they turn on him. When he turns on their agendas, they turn on him. Okay? And so now you have Charlie Kirk. After we did ban the ADL in September of 2023, Charlie Kirk was banned. He came out in favor of banning the ADL too. And he started denouncing Jonathan Greenblatt and their censorship and the ADL and the havoc and its anti-white agenda and its open borders agenda, its radical Marxist agenda and hate-filled agenda. Charlie Kirk was extremely outspoken against the ADL for the last 2 years before he was assassinated. And we also know he said things like, these left-wing Jewish organizations are primarily responsible for a lot of the open borders, radical Marxist policies in the United States. And he was begging with his Jewish friends and his Zionist friends to abandon that and to be America first. And so he was a big enemy of the ADL and had been denouncing them for 2 years. And then he's killed, and the ADL and the premier ADL partnered FBI team is the one that gets sent to investigate. And then a few weeks after that, Kash Patel is making these weird statements like, the ADL sucks and it's terrible, and we're going to sever our relationship. The FBI is going to sever its relationship with the ADL. And there's an online campaign, a fake online campaign for a day or two to attack the ADL again, whatever. It's all fake because they're still there. They're still present doing censorship on the back end of all the social media platforms. They're still partnered up with Elon. They're still running these advertiser boycotts. They're still in their Connecticut office. Nothing's been done. It was all window dressing. Why is Kash?
He gets more and more brazen. What was the last thing he said? They sent information about anti-Israel guys to the FBI. He said that out loud recently.
Oh, who did?
Greenblatt. He said we are giving the information about anti-Israel and this crazy anti-Israel. Yeah, he says it out loud.
Pam Bondi giving speeches Pam Bondi's greatest mission is to basically stamp out any quote unquote anti-Semitism wherever it is. That's her greatest aspiration. And Dan Bongino's greatest focus is Israel, and Kash Patel's biggest goal is protecting Israel. All of a sudden, everybody so. I saw that. He sent the ADL FBI team out to investigate. And then a few weeks later, he's making these weird statements about, ADL, we got to sever our relationship. And it's all just sort of, lip service. So I suspect that just like those prominent assassinations of yesteryear where there was critical and suspicious ADL involvement in the JFK, RFK, and MLK assassinations, if you twist my arm, I think the ADL, in my opinion, there's some breadcrumbs here. And especially given some of their statements, after the assassination. And, I don't trust them. And, I'm sorry, but there's just dozens. There's like 20, at least 20 parallels between the Charlie Kirk assassination and those three other big assassinations. There's so many parallels, and we've only barely scratched the surface. But here's where I wanted to like sort of wrap it all together. That triangle of interests: regime, ruling regime, right-wing Zionist Jewry, left-wing communist, liberal Jewry. This triangle of power all comes together, sets aside their differences, comes together to take out this guy who's their mutual enemy, right? And that's what Martin Luther King is. That's who killed him. He's taken out for all of that, right? Oh, the thing that I forgot to. So here's I went in all that dialogue about the Fair Housing Act that failed 3 times. Well, here's what happened. When Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, exactly 1 year to the day since his anti-Vietnam War speech. That's not a coincidence. Okay, these people love their symbolism, sending signals. Within 6 days, they passed the Fair Housing Act because immediately around the country, 100 riots erupt in 100 countries simultaneously, in 100 cities around the country simultaneously. Think BLM, remember all those riots, had like George Soros funding and backing from these Jewish organizations. They just spontaneously erupted all of a sudden all around the country and all around the world, just spontaneously happened. Well, that's what happened after Martin Luther King was killed. All of a sudden there were spontaneous riots in 100 cities. And Emanuel Seller, the Jewish member of Congress who had been pushing the Fair Housing Act, reintroduces the bill. And Lyndon Johnson calls Congress and urges them to pass this. And after failing 3 times in a row on the outrage and the public outcry and sympathy for Martin Luther King, on the 4th try, they finally get the Fair Housing Act passed in 6 days. In 6 days, he's killed on the 4th, on the 10th it's passed, and on the 11th, Lyndon Johnson signs it into law. Boom, boom, boom. And that wouldn't have happened without the death of Martin Luther King. Like, literally wouldn't have happened. The only thing that made that possible was the death of Martin Luther King and the subsequent hyper-organization of these riots in the immediate aftermath of that assassination. That's literally what happened, how it all came to pass. And now as a result, white Christian Americans have been displaced in the country their parents and grandparents and ancestors built.
And that's also a pattern. I mean, I'm reporting about these things for 20 or 30 years. And I wrote in a German mainstream magazine, I think for the first in the world, about 9/11, how it was an inside job. And also with 9/11, you have different purposes. Yeah? You have the wars in the Middle East, you have the Patriot Act, you have the gold under the World Trade Center. So they always, if they do something like that, they always achieve several goals.
Multiple
and that's
objectives.
Also the case.
They have simultaneous multiple objectives, but it's the same people. So when you come to Charlie Kirk, what was Charlie Kirk doing? Well, Charlie Kirk was coming out strongly against open borders. In fact, he was advocating for a complete immigration moratorium. We should back up. Because it's not just the positions that Martin Luther King had. It's not just the positions that Charlie Kirk had. A lot of people have these positions. A lot of people have those positions. They weren't killed. But those other people don't have national organizations that are now operating independently of the ruling regime and their original financial backers. They now have a major national organization with real political power beholden to one man. In the case of Martin Luther King, it's beholden to him. Not his donors, not to the Democrat Party, not to Lyndon Johnson, to him. With Charlie Kirk, same thing. It's this national organization. When Charlie was killed in September, there were about 250,000 current members of TPUSA and about 600,000 lifetime members. And that was set to grow. And the rumor was Charlie was going to run for governor of Arizona. And he probably would have won. So what's going to happen when you have a Charlie Kirk, who's the governor of Arizona now, with an entire national organization behind him that's beholden to him, that's against immigration, that wants an immigration moratorium, that wants us out of Iran, wants us out of Ukraine, and is pushing Christ first, America first, stay off porn, go to church, free speech, against censorship, This put him at odds with everybody. This put him at odds with the ADL and the left-wing Jewish organizations. It put him at odds with the right-wing pro-Israel Zionist organizations who want Israel or who want Iran taken out. It puts him at odds with the regime and the military-industrial complex that loves the Ukraine war and all the neocon wars and the and Silicon Valley and open borders, mass immigration. That put Charlie at odds with everybody, with a national organization that was following him, that was loyal to him, that was beholden to him. So it didn't matter that Charlie Kirk loved Israel and loved Jews and wanted Israel to be successful, because he was taking many positions that were actually against Israeli interests and the interests of organized Jews in general. And maybe he just didn't know it, but I think he did, because he was saying stuff like, well, if I ever go against these guys, they're going to kill me. I think they're going to kill me. I have no choice but to leave the pro-Israel cause. This is a lot like Martin Luther King, who's a Zionist, pro-Israel, and then later he shifts, but before he can come out publicly in wide release, they take him out. And then they've spent the whole time since then painting him as Martin Luther King as a Zionist. And that trip to Israel that he never was able to take. Well, this is the exact same story of Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk was changing. He was morphing. He wasn't all the way where we wanted him to be. That's true. But he was changing, and he was working for causes that were diametrically opposed to the ruling regime and the various wings of organized Jewry. And he was about to basically hit an inflection point in his life and in his career. And this last summer, he was making it okay for members of his organization to question AIPAC. He was making it okay for them to call for an end to aid to Israel. He was making it okay to talk about Epstein working for the Mossad in Israel. He was making it okay to do all these things. Now, personally, he's like, I still support Israel, but if you disagree with me, that's fine. We can talk about it, and you can still be a member in good faith of TPUSA. And let's just think about that for a second, because the last 2 years after October 7th, organized Jewry and these Jewish oligarchs and big organizations have been working to oust all of these Ivy League presidents that were at these universities that were hosting all these anti-Israel rallies and the anti-BDS movement. And they got several of these presidents switched out. They shook these universities down for hundreds of millions of dollars. They threatened to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars unless they enforced laws and policies against anti-Semitism and against the BDS movement. They spent the last 2 years trying to drum out all the organized opposition to Israel for the last 2 years has come from leftists on college campuses, basically. That's like been the main nexus of resistance to Israel, protests on college campuses. They spent the last 2 years getting rid of that. Well, here comes Charlie Kirk re-platforming it all on the right. They spent the last 2 years trying to get rid of it on the left, and now he's platforming it, making it okay for dissidents on the right to talk about, have the same conversations and say the same things. And his followers, his young followers in TPUSA were much more radical than Charlie Kirk. And so if you're the people who backstopped Charlie Kirk, and you were trying to and he was supposed to be your champion to drum up support for Israel, he was failing. He was failing. The majority of youth in America don't support Israel, despite Charlie's best efforts. In spite of Charlie's best efforts, we can say it. Charlie was really trying hard to get people to be on board with Israel, but he was failing. He was failing. He was failing. And so now this reminds us of Martin Luther King, Like they're trying desperately to pass the Fair Housing Act, and they couldn't. And now Martin Luther King has become useless to them to get it passed. And now he becomes more useful dead than alive. Same thing with Charlie Kirk. Charlie's alive, but not only has he been unsuccessful at this point, but now he's having a change of heart and doesn't even want to try anymore. And what's worse, he's allowing people to talk about the opposite stuff we want him to talk about. So that makes it even worse. So now he's not just useless. Now he's like actually working against us. So he's useless, so we have to make him useful. So let's make him a martyr.
I think the motive is very clear here. I just want to add that in this case there is really proof of the involvement of Israel. I can't stress this enough. That are these Google searches, because the probability of all these Google searches from there is basically zero. It's in a scientific sense you cannot never say zero, but it's close to zero. It's absolutely impossible that all these people were searched from Israel before that. That's my main proof that Israel is involved. But let's go into
Too suspicious.
yeah. Initially I wanted to go into details with you, also with videos and so on, but I don't want, because it was such an interesting talk, I don't want to fuck it up if I fuck something up, with the videos. So just give me your opinion about certain theories, the exploding mic theory and so on. Just give me and maybe we make another interview, because this was already so interesting, where we go into the videos and I don't have to be afraid, to destroy all the 90 minutes before. So, but just give me your opinion on what exactly killed him.
Yeah, well, the thing I'm most certain about was that this narrative that we've been fed, that it was Tyler Robinson with a 100-year-old gun with 30-06, from the Losi Center, that like Charlie's neck of steel stopped, just a little hole in the fleshy part of his neck right here. Hogwash, bull crap, nope. So I don't believe that. What did kill Charlie Kirk? I don't know yet. I'm working on a process of elimination. Like a lot of people said, well, maybe it was maybe there was a palm gun by Rick Cutler.
Yeah, but I never believed that. We don't have any recoil.
Yeah, I think we've eliminated that. That's not what happened. There's a lot of reasons why no. So we eliminated that. People said, well, maybe it was like from a tunnel underneath him, or somebody shot him from the underground. Well, we've been able to eliminate that too. Other people have made other theories that we've been able to eliminate. And so now what we're working on is, well, maybe a gunshot from a different direction with a different kind of caliber. Something that was more angled that maybe hit him in the spine. That's why there's no exit wound, possibly that. Maybe an exploding microphone with a shaped charge that was meant to simulate a gunshot sound and blast and make people think he'd been shot. But,
Oh, wait. I didn't hear that theory that the microphone itself... but that would be, you could measure that the microphone itself gave the sound of the, I didn't hear that.
The explosion could have sounded like a gunshot to people, right? And so people would think that he'd been shot by a gun, but he hadn't been, right? It was like a shape.
But they did this triangle thing where the shot came from.
And I'm not convinced by any of those. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm not trying to gatekeep it. Some of those have been falsified, but there's I don't know, at least a dozen different triangulations. Everybody's got, without a specific knowledge of the round and some other things, it's very difficult to perform those acoustic analyses from what I can understand. And there have been so many of them. This guy says it's over here, that guy says it's over there, another person says it's back here. There's for every different person, it's coming from a different direction. So I don't know what to make of those. I don't know what to make of those. But I certainly think it could have been a gunshot, but the exploding mic is interesting because they destroyed the crime scene quickly on an early morning on a Sunday in Utah County, where I used to live there. Everything's closed in Utah County on Sunday. Like when I was in college, they would even turn off the vending machines on Sunday, like on campus. That's how devout a lot of Utah, like the heart of Utah, right? And it's a little different now. Things are a little bit more open now than they used to be, but there's still gas stations will be closed. Gas stations and grocery stores will be closed on Sunday. It's not untypical. So to have major landscaping work to be done early on a Sunday morning, and now we know that was basically planned on the fly Saturday night to Sunday morning, just 3 days after the assassination. They ripped up all the sod, repaved over the whole crime scene, redid all the tiles in the tunnel behind, and we have to ask ourselves why. Why did they destroy the crime scene? Well, again, we go back to Martin Luther King, JFK, and RFK, which all of their crime scenes were destroyed quickly as well. In the case of JFK, they hosed down the pavement and the grass, and they shipped off the limousine and had it cleaned out and repaired and reupholstered without being examined for all the trace evidence. In RFK's situation, they lost. There was bullet holes or there could have been bullet holes in the walls, in the ceiling tiles, and in the door frames. And the LA police lost all of that evidence. They just lost it, just disappeared. And so, witnesses, everybody agrees that Saran was in front of RFK, and the autopsy is conclusive. It says the death shot came from behind him. So it couldn't have been RFK. So, and that there were, and acoustic analysis has since shown that at least 12, maybe 13 shots were fired, and Saran's gun only held like 8. So there were multiple guns shooting, rounds. All of that evidence disappeared. And then in the case of Martin Luther King, at least 3 witnesses placed a shot coming from some bushes near the Lorraine Motel, not from the bathroom window at the boarding house where allegedly James Earl Ray had alleged to have taken the shot. And at 7 a.m. the next morning, Memphis Public Works was out there, and they cut down all the hedges, cut all the grass, chopped down some tree limbs, destroyed the entire crime scene, like hours afterwards, right? Just hours, so not even, it's like 12 hours afterwards. So when I saw that they had destroyed Charlie's crime scene, I'm like, this is the cover-up in full effect, just like always. So that's another parallel, right? And of course, we have to contend with the magic bullet theory, the man of checks to Charlie's neck of steel, where a round is coming from up here, but somehow, it's coming from up here, but somehow it hits him here, and then somehow it smashes the vertebrae up here, without going, it's like, and it's a 30-06 round that just somehow gets trapped under his skin. Like, what? That's a magic bullet. Well, we've heard the magic bullet theory, the JFK and the magic bullet that hit 2 guys and causes 7 wounds with 1 undamaged bullet. And then we have another magic bullet with RFK, right? Where the autopsy report says the death shot came from behind, but Saran was convicted when he only ever shot from front. So somehow we have a magic bullet that Saran shot from the front, went around and boomeranged behind RFK's head. And then you have Martin Luther King, who was allegedly shot with this Remington rifle that used 30-06 ammo by James Earl Ray. But that gun was dropped off conveniently in a bundle right on the side of this, out in front of Knife's, Knife's Sporting Goods, or he had a guy named Knife had a store. They dropped, the gun is dropped in a bundle with binoculars and the rifle and all the ammunition with his fingerprints all over it in a nice little bundle. Just like Tyler Robinson's gun was dropped in the bushes with his fingerprints on it. And in the case of Martin Luther King, they recovered the slug, and it had enough striations on it to do a ballistics match. They didn't ever do a ballistics match to the alleged rifle. They didn't do one. What's more, the FBI the next day, the FBI did a scope test on the rifle that James Earl Ray is alleged to have used, and it was off by over 5 inches. They cited it. It was off. It was off by over 5 inches, so it wasn't even zeroed out. And the bullets that were in the drop package didn't match the cartridge in the gun, the spent casing in the gun. All of these facts were ignored and never really made it anywhere because James Earl Ray was convinced by his lawyer to plead guilty. So none of this stuff really ever entered the record, and the government has always used the inconclusiveness of the gun to basically they said this is the gun, disprove that you have to disprove that this was the gun, which is backwards. Normally it's like you have to prove that this was the gun, but they didn't match the ballistics. The spent casing didn't match the bullets in the drop package, and the gun wasn't zeroed. The sight wasn't zeroed, and so you couldn't establish this was the murder weapon. But they said, well, it's inconclusive, and therefore they said, well, that makes it harder to disprove. They assume it's the murder weapon, but it's hard to now disprove that it's the murder weapon because they have all this bad evidence. But the base assumption is that it was. So now, how do you take bad evidence and overturn the base assumption? Well, you can't, and so it's all backwards. So another magic shot, and so now again we come to Charlie Kirk, and it's the same story all over again. A magic bullet, a magic shot. It's like paint by numbers. It's paint by numbers.
What do you think happens in the trial? Because there is no evidence. So a 10-year-old could defend them. I think the defense team is not on his side. I mean, if there would be zero evidence against my guy, I would want that it's a public setting. So it's absolutely ridiculous. And so my personal theory is either they kill him, that would be very suspicious, or they get him to plead guilty and promise him maybe to get out of jail through the back door, because you never know if somebody is really in there. What do you think will
Well,
happen there?
it's hard to predict. I have worries about all of these scenarios because the people who did this, they haven't stopped. They're still scheming. They're still planning. They're still arranging for multiple contingencies, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Obviously, James Earl Ray was apprehended, I think, in June of 1968. It was like two months after the alleged assassination. And then he got some lawyers who worked with him until March of 1969, a year later. And he got a new lawyer named Percy Foreman. And Percy Foreman convinced James Earl Ray to plead guilty, said, for various reasons, but the biggest reason was because Foreman said, I'm in poor health and I can't give you the biggest defense that you need. You should plead guilty, then get a new lawyer, and then have your new lawyer file a motion to change your plea. This is what he told James Earl Ray. And James Earl Ray said, well, I can't afford a new lawyer. And Percy Foreman says, that's okay, I'll give you some money to get a new lawyer. So that's what he did. And they wrote out a letter and a contract or whatever. And he gave James Earl Ray's brother, Jerry, $500 to get James Earl Ray a new lawyer. And on March 10th, 1969, James Earl Ray entered his guilty plea as counseled by his lawyer, Percy Foreman. And then on March 13th, with his new lawyer, he filed a motion to change his plea, and the judge denied it. So now he's stuck. He's guilty. He pled guilty. He's guilty. Now, actually, I shouldn't say it was denied. He filed for the new plea on March 13th. The judge, Preston Battle, was literally reviewing James Earl Ray's appeal, or his motion, when he died mysteriously of a heart attack at his desk with his head resting on James Earl Ray's motion for his plea change. Mysterious heart attack out of nowhere. Like literally with his head resting on James Earl Ray's motion on March 31st, just 3 weeks, like 2.5 weeks later. So like what's going to happen with Tyler Robinson? Oh, and by the way, at the time, Tennessee law was if the judge dies while your motion is in progress, you're automatically granted your motion. So
the other one was granted.
The other one was granted, his wasn't. And so, they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court even denied James Earl Ray. And then James Earl Ray ended up dying, and they ended up having a civil trial brought by the King family, and they won. And they demonstrated in the civil trial that there was another criminal network that was behind the assassination of Martin Luther King that involved the U.S. government. And that's been solved in a court of law, but nobody knows that. Nobody's heard of that. Nobody talks about that. It's just still blamed on James Earl Ray. And,
no movie about
and so it's crazy. So when it comes to Tyler Robinson and the Charlie Kirk assassination, I don't know what leverage they have on Tyler Robinson. I'm sure they have leverage. I'm sure he's guilty of something. What is he guilty of? I'm not sure. In the case of James Earl Ray always alleged that he thought he was helping Raul do some weapons trafficking. I don't think he even knew there was a plot against Martin Luther King. I think he thought that he was like this guy had him buying guns and returning guns and getting other guns and going here and going there. I think he thought he was helping this guy do some gun deals.
Like in the Las Vegas shooting, for example, maybe.
Yeah, like what was going on there, right? So like what was going on with Tyler Robinson? I don't know. What's he guilty of? I'm not sure. What the leverage do they have over him? I don't know, but something, and probably. And so is he going to plead guilty? Is he going to plead guilty to get a lesser charge and keep his mouth shut? Is he going to be taken out? I'm sure they have a lot of. They're preparing for several contingencies because they really do not want any of this investigated. And now Erica Kirk has filed a motion for a speedy trial. Like they're saying that the defense is unnecessarily delaying and it's increasing her agony or whatever. And so.
And who is that?
I forgive him. Remember how she forgave him quickly? I forgive him. But now she wants a speedy trial for him. They don't.
Let's talk about the lawyer. That's absolutely unbelievable that the lawyer of Erica Kirk is represented Alex Acosta during the when he had to talk about the Epstein plea deal. I mean, that's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and apparently, from what I read, he was Acosta's lawyer as recently as 9 days after Charlie's assassination. Now he's Erica Kirk's lawyer. So this guy who basically got a sweetheart deal for Jeffrey Epstein, right, or whatever. I'm a little hazy on all the details, but Alex Acosta got a sweetheart deal negotiated a sweetheart deal for Epstein back in like what 2009 or 2010 or 11 or something.
Yeah.
This Jeffrey Neiman was the lawyer involved in that, and now he's representing Erica Kirk.
I
That's
mean,
just, I mean, come on, what are we doing? What are we doing? So when I remember when I said that they're still scheming and they still are planning for all eventualities and multiple contingencies, I think it's still
yeah,
ongoing. This psyop that took Charlie Kirk out is still going. It's still psyoping. And so, is he
yes,
going to plea out? Is he going to plea out? Is he going to be suicided? Is he, or something could happen like Saran, where Saran's lawyers did not give him a good, vigorous defense. He did have legal representation, but they didn't give him a good defense. And I'll give you an example. They had the autopsy findings that said the death shot came from behind, and all the witnesses and everybody knew that he only shot from several feet in the front. Right there, that should have been grounds for acquittal. But his defensive lawyers did never argue that point. So is Tyler going to get a good, thorough, vigorous defense? I think people are really worried that he's not, that they're going to mail it in and give a bad faith effort. It's going to look like they tried, but they failed. Is it going to be that? Is he going to be suicided? Is he just going to plead guilty like James Earl Ray? Like, I don't know, but I'm watching. And I don't trust anything right now. I don't trust anybody, because again, like they've got to sell this to the public and put this to bed. They've got to put this to rest. They got to get an acquittal. They got to get a guilty plea. Not an acquittal. They got to get a guilty plea, a conviction, or disappear him or something, right? Like one of these things, perhaps, or maybe there's a payoff. Maybe there's going to be a payoff where he'll serve some time and then be released and keep his mouth shut. I mean, I don't know. But like, I don't believe that he acted alone. I don't believe that he just rolled up to campus with his grandpa's 110-year-old rifle and took one shot without zeroing in the scope, and took out Charlie Kirk, under a high pressure situation when he's never killed anybody before, with 1 week of planning, and then made the perfect getaway. And just like, I mean, just, it beggars belief. I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. It's and there's too many other telltale signs and parallels, so I don't believe it. And we've seen a lot of lies and inconsistencies coming out of TPUSA. And I'm like, it's the easiest thing in the world to just tell what you know and tell the truth. But it seems like they are allergic to anything doing with the truth. And now they're sending out cease and desist letters against people who are digging into the money. It's just lie after lie after lie after lie. And, it's just like, how many lies do we have to tolerate? They just kind of keep moving the goalposts. And we're just supposed to keep swallowing all these lies. Because until we can conclusively show how he was killed, then the narrative stands, right? I mean, that's really kind of how it works. At this point, we don't have any power. We don't have any political power. We don't have any legal power. The best we can hope for is to get enough of the American people and public on our side, kind of like the Epstein files, to where like the public is mostly behind, like, that Epstein was dirty and working on behalf of a foreign power. And we know that foreign power, and there's a lot of outrage and a lot of pressure from the public over the Epstein files, a ton. And I think that's the best case scenario we can hope for in the Charlie Kirk assassination, that our network of informants and investigators is able to generate enough doubt, and not just enough doubt, but enough plausible replacement narrative to create enough public outcry and pressure to where the conventional narrative, just people aren't going to buy it, or the whatever happens in court is going to have major competition going forward and be disputed forever going forward. I think that's the best we can hope for. This idea that we're going to completely solve the crime and prove who did it and find the guy with the smoking gun in his hand and all, I don't know that we're going to be able to do that. These people are very careful. They're very thorough. They plan things such that, like, the murder weapon can't lead back to them, and the patsy can't lead back to them. That's the whole point of having a patsy. He doesn't lead back to you, right? So the best we can do is basically cast enough doubt, like legitimate doubt, on the Tyler Robinson narrative that people are just like, yeah, this is not what happened, so we're being lied to. So I know I'm being lied to. That's important. We have to establish that we're being lied to beyond a reasonable doubt. And then I think we have to be able to, it would be helpful if we can come up with something solid to replace that narrative with. I don't know if we'll be able to do that. I'm hopeful we'll be able to do that. That's why I'm doing what I do. But I don't know if we're going to get there. But maybe. It's just a lot of weird stuff. They dispatched with the SUV that Charlie was carried to the hospital in. They got rid of it quietly, secretly, quickly, against the company car rental policy. It's part of the crime scene. Why did they do that? Again, the JFK limousine. They got rid of it and cleaned it up. That's what they did with the Charlie Kirk SUV. The little black bits of glass on the floor. What was that all about? Was that from the microphone? Was it from something else? I don't know. But that's where we're at on that.
So my last question, a little provocative, is Israel behind everything? Because every really major thing in the U.S. seems to be tied to Israel.
As my friend Dan Bilzerian would say, if you blame any problem on organized Jewish supremacy, you're probably going to be right just 90% of the time. And that might sound unfair to some people and anti-Semitic, but it's just kind of true. Number one, it's just kind of true. That's not to say it's just them. People get offended. Well, what about the CIA? Or what about the FBI? Or what about this politician? Or what about that banker? Or this guy, he's not a Jew. They'll say these types of things. And I'm like, okay, that's fair. But let's think about it. The world of organized crime is dog eat dog. And there's always a bigger fish. And there's always consolidation. And the Italian mafia got taken out because a bigger mob beat it out. A bigger mob beat the Italian mafia and took it over, took over its territory. And I think we all know what mob that is. So now I'll use an example. When you're let's say I'm a drug kingpin, and LA's my territory. LA's my city. I control LA. Does that mean I control everything in the city? Every little pickpocket, petty anti-criminal, and a little, cheap little, 2-bit gangster on every street corner? Does that mean they're all part of my network? No, many of them are part of my network, but not all of them. And maybe there's some dummy over here on some street corner who's running a little scam. And maybe I don't care because it's so small and it's not really infringing on my business. So I don't care. I don't do anything about it. But I know about it. And maybe at some point I'll be like, I'll make him an offer he can't refuse. I'm like, you know what? You owe me some money. You owe me some protection money for operating in my city. Or maybe I let him operate on his own until he gets big enough to where I'm just going to move in on him and take over his business. I'll be like, hey, thanks for building up this section of my business for me. And I'll let you keep running this section of my business for a cut, and you get to live, But the point is the kingpin in a city, ultimately he's the buck stops with him, right? And he's either running it or he knows who is. And he has the power to stop it or take it over if he wants, right? And that's what I think this globo, international, cosmopolitan, imperial mafia is. Is it the only gang out there? No. Is it the only power out there? No. But it's the most powerful. It's the most organized. It's got the most fingers in the most pies. And it's got its eyes on everything. And it's got the power to go, move in on whatever it wants to, when it wants to. So, we saw this happen with the Ivy League universities after October 7th, when there were these anti-Israel protests that erupted on these campuses. They realized, we need to go exert our influence. So they basically moved their Death Star over to those Ivy League campuses and aimed their big Death Star gun at them. And moved those university presidents and administrators out of there and got Congress to pass some legislation, got new people in there, new policies implemented, and now they have what they want, So they have this, so they're the big man on campus, right? They're when TikTok was working against their interests, well, they just organized to get TikTok banned. And then they bought it. A hostile takeover, which happened 6 days after Charlie was killed and TPUSA became the subject of a possible hostile takeover, by the way, if you're keeping track. So do they control everything? Do they run everything? No, but they have the power to go get control of anything they want at any given time. And when you have a Death Star like that nobody else has, then it keeps everybody in line, to borrow a famous Star Wars phrase. It keeps everybody in line. They got a Death Star. I don't. I got to play nice with them. So they're in bed with the drug cartels in Mexico and South America, international sex trafficking, casinos, gambling, organized crime. They got the media, Hollywood, the government. They got their fingers in every pie, and because they have so much money, because they're so highly organized, and because they've gotten so much legislative protection over the years as victims, they're able to do things and enjoy protections and a status and a power and an influence that other groups don't have. White people, we're not allowed to have our own organizations that look after our own interests. If we do, we're called Nazis, and and the Zio Mafia will send the feds to destroy us, infiltrate us, implicate us, entrap us, whatever. Right? This happened to Randy Weaver. This happened at Patriot Front. This happened at Charlottesville in 2017. It's happened many times. It's happening to Return to the Land. Eric Arvel's, organization, Return to the Land in the Ozarks. They're just trying to have a white community out in the woods, and it's being attacked by the ADL and other Jewish organizations and legislators and lawyers and stuff. White people, we're not allowed to organize and do our own things, so we're at a disadvantage. But they can go all over the world, have as many organizations as they want, and have automatic victimhood status and give them everything they want because they got this big Death Star that where they point it at anybody, it can cancel you or, in some cases, kill you for, literally. So that's where we're at. That's where we're at. That's how I answer that question. Do they own the whole company? No. But they own the most of the company. They own enough of the company to where they own more of it than anybody else, and they can control it more than anybody else.
I think that's a fitting analogy. Thank you, Sam Parker.
Yep.